And if you're older, you're smarter. I just believe that. Even if they're wrong, their wrongness is rooted in more information than you have.
What is happening?
This is time.
You understand that what I'm telling you is a universal truth.
You don't like ice cream?
It's too cold.
Nothing melts away the cold like a delicious hot bowl of Campbell's soup.
Hey, long time no see. I know I haven't done anything for quite a while and I don't really have a good excuse for that. Basically, nothing came up that gave me a strong urge to make a video. Until recently. For those of you unaware, YouTuber and recurring EFAP guest Blessed Southpaw has recently brought shame to us all by daring to suggest that a show is badly written despite the fact that people like it. Luckily for us, Nerdrotic came to save the day, using his vast array of life experience to reveal the universal truth to Southpaw, showing him the error of his ways and giving him a cold splash of reality, which strangely felt like a hot splash of soup. Now, I have not seen a single episode of Batman the Animated Series, so it may seem like I'm grossly unprepared to talk about this. But don't worry, I'm not here to talk about the show's quality. In fact, if you like, we can start off by saying that every episode is a 10 out of 10. That's probably not the case, but God, it feels good to hear, doesn't it? What I am here to talk about is how Gary looks at media and how he chooses to argue. Even if you think Southpaw's criticisms of the show are wrong, hopefully you'd agree that Gary's defenses are worse. Let's begin.
Now, one of the guys who used to be on the show got a little bit of trouble today. He got in a little bit of trouble today. Southpaw went on Twitter, started talking shit about Batman the Animated Series. I was like, I'm sitting there watching it going, dude. Like, it's one thing to come out and say, I watched it and I didn't like it. Nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong. But then to come out and say it's bad. No. You see, you're probably young. I'm going to assume you're younger than me, Southpaw, probably by decades.
And you are about a decade younger than Bill Maher. But I doubt you would take that into consideration when he says,
comics are for kids.
So there's this thing called life experience.
On face value, it would seem that the only life experience you need to review a TV show would be watching the show. But I'm willing to grant that it's a bit more complicated than that. Criticizing media and arguing for your position are both skills, and like any skill, they can be improved with time. So on paper, your life experience gives you an advantage. But of course, this doesn't mean that people should place any special value on what you say because of that alone. If someone's been a professional writer for 30 years and their latest book is mediocre at best, people aren't gonna praise the book simply because it was written by an experienced author. If anything, they'll hold that against the author. You've been writing for 30 years and this was the best you could do? Similarly, if you defend Batman the Animated Series in ways that are vague or self-contradictory, bringing up your life experience would only make things worse for you, because you're setting people up to expect you to make good arguments.
And there's this thing called being in its time.
There are aspects of media that are directly affected by when it was made. The first example that comes to mind is visuals. While special effects do rely on talent, they also benefit from modern technology. So all else being equal, modern movies will usually look aesthetically better than older movies. Also, language changes with time. So a Shakespearean play can feel dated simply because of how the characters speak. Thirdly, cultural sensibilities can change. So a story can also be dated by its refusal to show something that nowadays is considered inoffensive. It is completely reasonable for these things to hurt someone's immersion into the story, but we can forgive these problems because they are all the direct result of when the story was written. Now, does this mean we should overlook all of a show's problems simply because that show was made a long time ago? Hopefully, you'd answer no. If you use the standard of internal consistency, it doesn't matter when a show was made because the standard already judges the story on its own terms. It doesn't put any rules or restrictions on the writers outside of the rules and restrictions the writers already put on themselves. You can have characters make stupid decisions, just don't portray them as being intelligent. You can have characters do something morally questionable, just don't portray them as being virtuous. You can even have a story in which nothing makes sense, so long as it's a consistent rule that nothing makes sense.
And when you're trying to subjectively or objectively review a work, it's very hard for a young person to come in and like review Batman the Animated Series cold unless you're like a Batman fan.
How? If he's coming into it cold, that just means he's coming into it less biased than he otherwise would be. If anything, wouldn't that make it easier?
And yeah, if you're going to objectively review Batman the Animated Series and keep it to the same standards as a live action film put out, a live action contemporary film, well, of course it's going to look shitty to you. Of course.
Really? Batman the Animated Series would look bad when compared to The Last Jedi, Captain Marvel, Man of Steel? You're saying this as if it's obvious that modern films are so well made, but that's not obvious to a lot of people. In fact, you're saying this in the middle of a live stream titled Hollywood Wants to Destroy What We Love.
But it's true. They hate what we love. Lord of the Rings is everything Hollywood hates right now. Do you think for 1 second that they could make something even close to that? Fuck no.
But now all of a sudden you're gonna put him on this pedestal and say that one of your favorite cartoons is crap by comparison? Your point would be much stronger if we were only talking about, like, the visuals. But when Southpaw says that Batass is bad, he's referring to the writing. Speaking of which, I feel like now is a good time to talk about what criticism Southpaw has made against the show, because if I wait for Gary to bring it up, I won't get the chance. Southpaw has been most public with his criticisms of the episode Heart of Ice, more specifically, this scene.
Ooh, what was that stuff?
The only way to fight a cold.
Some of the problems Southpaw has with this scene are that beating Mr. Freeze with chicken soup goes against the serious tone this show is praised for. It damages Batman's character to have him make smart alecky quips while a man is struggling to breathe. And it makes Batman look incompetent for not exploiting this weakness whenever Mr. Freeze returns. Even if I assume that all of these points are invalid, it doesn't seem like they have anything to do with the show's age. And if they do, you need to explain how. Otherwise, you could just say it was made in its time to excuse any possible flaw the show could have.
But see, the context of something coming out in its time does matter. That's why it matters for a Spider-Man 2 argument, too.
Yes, it matters, but to what extent? Does it only apply to specific criticisms, or is it a blanket excuse for all flaws? Also, while Spider-Man 2 was made a while ago, it's still considerably more recent than Batman the Animated Series. So how long ago does something have to be made for this context to matter? Is it safe to say that Spider-Man 3 is bad? If so, why? Was it made recently enough that it's not in its time? Or does it have problems that are unrelated to the fact that it's in its time?
Yeah. I can call a classic a piece of shit when I try to compare it with today's filmmaking. That would be harder and harder because the storytelling really fucking sucks these days, but you know what I mean.
Whoa, Gary. Dude. It would be one thing to say, I don't like them. Nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong. But to say, they suck. No. Okay, but seriously, so far your argument has been based around the idea that movies and TV shows get better and better with time. So when analyzing an older piece of media, we need to lower our standards because of course it's not going to be as good as anything made today. So the moment you complain that films these days have stories that suck, you destroy your own argument. Because you imply that it's reasonable for us to expect older stories to be at least as good as modern stories. And since Southpaw heavily focuses on story when judging media, he shouldn't have to lower his standards.
So to say something is objectively bad is disingenuous.
Well, Southpaw isn't saying it's objectively bad. He did used to believe in objective quality, but he's since changed his mind on the issue. Now he would just say something like it's internally inconsistent, or it's bad if you stick to the standard that leads you to believe that The Last Jedi is bad, which is something you already agreed to.
If you're going to objectively review Batman the Animated Series and keep it to the same standards as a live action film put out, a live action contemporary film, well, of course it's going to look shitty to you.
But you know what? Forget what I said. Let's pretend Southpaw is calling the show objectively bad, just so that you have the chance to explain why doing so is so disingenuous.
Because you have, for one, nobody can really be that objective. Everybody has bias, however slight they do. Because we're human, it's fine.
So this is a very broad objection to make. Like you just said, everyone has a bias no matter how small. So if that means it's disingenuous to call Batman the Animated Series objectively bad, it would also mean it's disingenuous to make any claim not just about objective quality, but about anything being objectively true. Because again, this applies to everyone. Now, if you actually believe that it is disingenuous to make any objective claim, that would be one thing, but somehow I doubt you do. Now, this doesn't mean that bias shouldn't be brought up as an objection, it just means that if it is, it should be more substantive than your bias. I don't know how, but you are. What you could bring up is what biases you think Southpaw has, how those biases could be affecting him, and if he is or isn't doing enough to correct for those biases. Now, you haven't said what specific bias you think Southpaw has. In fact, you criticized him for not being biased enough.
And when you're trying to subjectively or objectively review a work, it's very hard for a young person to come in and like review Batman the animated series cold unless you're like a Batman fan.
But just to be nice, I'll think of one for you. Southpaw is a fan of a similar animated show, The Batman.
Batman the Animated Series was not a Batman show that I grew up with. However, there was a Batman show that I grew up with.
The Batman?
The Batman.
The Batman.
Now,
So that might give him an incentive to tear one show down in order to build the other up. This might cause him to be unreasonably harsh to Batas and to criticize it for things he wouldn't otherwise criticize a TV show for. But it would be hard for you to convince me that he's guilty of this, since earlier you complained about the fact that he's holding everything to the same standard.
If you're gonna objectively review Batman the Animated Series and keep it to the same standards as a live-action film put out, a live-action contemporary film, well, of course it's gonna look shitty to you.
Plus, Southpaw has been perfectly willing to give the show credit where it's due.
so I watched On Leather Wings with him and pointed out all the stuff that I liked about that episode. And then we watched Perchance to Dream next, right?
Yes, we did. So fucking good. Inception
Yeah.
better than Inception.
Practically a better, practically perfect, I want to say.
That the one where he dreams that he's not Batman, like it's all a nightmare.
Yeah.
Made up by...
induced by the Mad Hatter.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that one I said was like, okay, so On Leather Wings was like an 8, and Perchance to Dream was like a 10. And then we watched It's Never Too Late, which was this really hard-hitting drama about this aging gangster that you wouldn't think would be like really appealing to watch in a show that's supposed to be about Batman, but it was really engaging and really good. And that one was like a 7 or an 8.
Which shows he's entirely capable of drawing conclusions that go against what his bias would lead him to. Finally, something Southpaw could do to correct his bias would be to approach people who already think the show is good and run his arguments by them. Which is exactly what he did.
But, you know, it wasn't a show that I loved as a kid, but it's a show that Evan loved as a kid. And so he's even on record for saying that he thought that Heart of Ice was the best episode of the show. Because Evan went into the show with me with a fond memory of it from his childhood, and he would say, this next episode's good, this next episode's going to be good. And then we'd watch it, and it wasn't good. So Evan was able to figure out very early on, he can't trust his memory of what episodes are good. We watched Almost Got Him, an episode that a lot of people consider to be one of the best episodes of the series. Meme Repository, what would you like to tell these people about Almost Got Him?
Well, you see, the dialogue and the interaction, the banter between the villains is so entertaining, and I would consider the flashbacks to be entertaining, but from, a purely writing, execution point of view, internal consistency, it falls to absolute pieces. I like it. I am entertained by it. I think that it's very clear they were having a lot of fun making it, and that kind of translates. But if you use the same standards that we judge other media by, it kind of just it falls to pieces, especially when you compare it to what the show is already capable of.
Obviously, the fact that they agree with him doesn't automatically make Southpaw right, but it does mitigate the role that his personal bias played in his conclusion. Now, let's ask these same questions about you. What potential bias might you have? Well, you're a fan of the show, so you might have an emotional investment in it being considered good. How might this bias be influencing you? Well, it may cause you to excuse problems that you wouldn't excuse in other stories, which is exactly what happened. You explicitly advocated that the show be held to a lower standard than pieces of media you consider to be bad. What could you do to minimize this bias? You could reserve your judgment until you have a decent understanding of what Southpaw's criticisms are, and maybe even rewatch some key episodes of Batman the Animated Series. And it doesn't seem like you've done this. You haven't mentioned what problems Southpaw brought up, which means you either don't know what they are, or you do and don't want to address them. Instead, you're making defenses that are so broad and all-encompassing that they could be said in response to any potential criticism against the show. Long story short, you and Southpaw both have biases, and yet he appears to have done a better job keeping it in check.
And it's totally fine to not like Batman the Animated Series. You're wrong. You're absolutely wrong.
Really? For not liking it? So even if he said every episode is excellently written, I couldn't find any significant problems, however, I personally wasn't entertained, he would be wrong?
But there are certain universal truths There are certain universal truths. And you can not like those universal truths, but to say they're bad would just make you wrong. Lord of the Rings is the greatest trilogy of all time. You could not like the movie, but it's still the greatest trilogy of all time. Batman the Animated Series is the greatest animated series committed to television. You could not like the series, but it's still the greatest of all time. You could not like ice cream, but you'd be wrong. You could not like puppies, but you'd be wrong. These are universal truths.
Calling anything a universal truth is a really big claim to make. So what is the criteria? What does it take for a statement to gain the status of universal truth? The first definition that comes to mind is something that's very well demonstrated to be objectively true regardless of what anyone thinks. But that definition doesn't really work the way you're using it, mainly because you brought up liking puppies and ice cream as an example, and that is as subjective as you can get. You're talking about someone's emotional reaction. Now, when talking about how good a movie or TV show is, we can separate our emotions from the discussion, but we can only do that if we have a clear standard for what makes them good or bad. And when you don't have a clear standard, saying that something is good becomes functionally no different than saying, I like it. The next idea for what you could mean is something that everyone unanimously agrees on, but this definition doesn't work either since Southpaw doesn't agree with you. That's why you're talking about this in the first place. So now what? Is it just about having a really big majority? Doesn't have to be unanimous, just has to be close to unanimous? Well, under that definition, we could call everything you said a universal truth, but that seems like a very odd way to define the term, and even then, it doesn't bring us to a point of, therefore, if you disagree, you're wrong. Like, if I met someone who told me they didn't like ice cream, sure, I'd be very surprised and I might even suspect that they're kidding. But if they're serious, it doesn't mean they're wrong, it just means they have unusual taste. Also, opinions change, so what happens if enough people stop believing that, say, Lord of the Rings is the best trilogy of all time? Would that cease to be a universal truth? I know I'm just assuming that you're using majority opinion as the metric, but that's honestly my best guess as to what you mean. And besides that, I find it very interesting that you aren't just saying Batman the Animated Series is good, or great, or even the best animated superhero show, but
the greatest animated series committed to television.
That's a really bold claim to make, and it implies people should be able to hold the show to a high standard. But you don't think they should. Earlier you said that Batass isn't going to look good when compared to a modern film. Well, what if it's compared to a modern cartoon? When held to the same standard, do you think that Batman the Animated Series would come out better than, say, Harley Quinn? If no, how could you possibly make the claim you just made? If yes, why did you make such a big deal out of the context of being in its time? If I bragged about how I was the fastest runner alive and this wasn't even up for debate, but also insisted I get a head start anytime someone challenged me to a race, do you think anyone would take me seriously?
So he was trying to make his argument and he wasn't being a dick about it. And he's another YouTuber and I don't want any heat brought to, he put up a Spider-Man 2 takedown and I completely disagreed with it.
I know you disagree, and so far your reason for disagreeing is very flimsy. It was made in its time. Again, I agree this argument can sometimes work, but it's not the get-out-of-jail-free card you seem to think it is. For example,
ladies and gentlemen, introducing the Holdo maneuver of the entire movie. This fucking thing was here this whole time. I want you to realize that throughout this entire fight scene, in all of the times that Ock had a grip on Spider-Man, or even landed a hit on him with one of his tentacles, that he actually had a blade hidden up at least one of them, and he just decided to not use it until now. My question is why? Why introduce this thing? Why establish that it exists? Why confirm that this entire fight could have ended before it even started? Why are you using this slow-ass method of killing Spider-Man that's going to give him more opportunities to escape than just sticking this blade through his head or his heart?
The basics of this argument are that if a competent villain has a knife and wants to kill someone, they should use the knife when there's as little distance between them as possible. But Doc Ock, an intelligent villain who wants to kill Spider-Man, doesn't do this. He refrains from using the knife when Spider-Man is constrained and can't dodge, and then pulls out the knife once they're separated. This means Doc Ock either isn't very smart or doesn't want to kill him, which calls into question why he pulled out a knife.
Spider-Man, he wasn't trying to kill Spider-Man. His issue was to get the money so he could finish.
You just admitted that he was trying to crush his skull earlier.
Unless you're willing to argue that we didn't understand knives as well in 2004 as we do now, saying it was made in its time isn't enough to defend this scene.
It's a well put together video, but anybody could I've seen some pretty well put together essay videos in praise of The Last Jedi. It didn't change my mind.
Considering how just moments ago you argued for your position by calling it a universal truth, I'm not really surprised that you don't change your mind often. But anyway, Last Jedi defense videos. I'm glad you brought those up. It is very common for people who defend The Last Jedi, or any movie that's widely criticized, to say, hey, all those plot holes you're pointing out in this movie also exist in movies you love. You don't actually care about internal consistency, you're just using it as an excuse to criticize this movie.
This is why people cling so tightly to quote-unquote plot holes. They see those as objective flaws that prove the film is bad, but that's not how films work. Virtually every one of those plot holes can be applied to older Star Wars films, and that never hurt anyone's enjoyment of those.
If you want, you can find plot holes anywhere. They're all over your favorite movies. In Lord of the Rings, the Eagles could have just flown the ring to Mount Doom and saved everyone all that trouble. In Toy Story, why does Buzz freeze like the other toys when he thinks he's a real person?
The point I want to make about plot holes is this. They are usually not the real reason people didn't enjoy a movie. There are almost always deeper and more personal issues with a film that prevented people from connecting with it, which aren't as easy to identify or articulate as plot holes are. But plot holes are very easy to explain, and since you didn't like the movie, and the plot hole is a problem in the movie, it's very easy to fall into the trap of saying you didn't like the movie because of the plot hole.
People are going to hate this magic wishing rock. But like, dude, did you hate the radioactive spider? The baby sent from the planet Krypton.
This was so that we could watch Luke apparently miraculously discover the power of telekinesis to escape his situation. Some people weren't really bugged by this, and actually people cheered. Some people were like, yeah, that's really cool. But I was like, it's just adding powers to already established rules in the universe from the previous film. It comes off as, well, we need him to escape somehow, so just allow the lightsaber that his mentor gave him to fly into his hand. And if someone wants to get a reasonable explanation, if they ask us, we can just say, well, that's how the Force works. Kind of sounds to me like a way to get around bad storytelling.
I also think a lot of the people bringing up those plot holes are using them to mask the underlying and totally valid reason why they didn't enjoy the film. And that's that in either of those scenarios, it wasn't the experience they wanted from a Star Wars film.
And you kind of proven them right. You want people to forgive a movie's problems just because it's old, even if those problems are unrelated to the movie's age. So now, anytime you criticize something made recently, no matter what problems you bring up, people will be fully justified in saying, that's not why you think it's bad, you only think it's bad because it's new.
Video, I guess there's a video essay, a 5-hour video essay on fucking Doctor Who. Who's gonna fucking watch a 5-hour video essay? Come on.
You're saying this in the middle of a 4-hour live stream, and you have other streams that are 5 hours or longer. Yeah, it takes longer to make a video when it's scripted and edited, but to the person watching it, it's still 5 hours. So what's the difference?
Come on, calm down now. Calm down now. But I digress. Batman the Animated Series is a universally loved thing by pretty much everybody. Which means it's good.
Well, I guess I was right earlier. Your definition of universal truth is just a lot of people agree. I kind of wish you would have just said this from the beginning. If you just said from the top that Batman the Animated Series is good because almost everyone likes it, and then maybe argue for why popularity is the best metric for quality, there would still be people who don't think that's a very good standard, myself included, but at least it would have been crystal clear what your standard is. But when you start off talking about life experience and the context of being in its time, you unnecessarily muddy the waters. Because for one, you don't need any life experience to know how popular a TV show is. You just need 5 seconds and access to the internet. And 2, Batman the Animated Series is still popular. So if popularity is the metric, when it was made is still irrelevant.
Which means it's good. Objectively, subjectively good.
Hey. To say that it's objectively good is
disingenuous. Because you have, for one, nobody can really be that objective. Everybody has bias, however slight they do. Because we're human. It's fine.
Do you remember when you said that? Probably not. It was a long time ago. 2 minutes to be exact. Plus, he was probably wrong anyway. After all, that Gary had 2 minutes less life experience than this Gary. Although it is unfair to hold the two Garys to the same standard, since the Gary from 2 minutes ago was made in his time.
It was financially successful, critically successful with the fans. So we can argue that, hey, not everything is good that's popular. You're right. Not everything that the critics love is good. You're right. Not everything that makes money is good. You're right. But when you have all three of those together, more times than not, it's objectively good.
So it's good because it made money, is liked by critics, and is liked by fans, even though by your admission, those things don't actually make a TV show good. But wait a second, you're strawmanning him. He said those things individually don't make a show good. Put together, they do. Fair enough, except he didn't actually make that claim. He hedged his bets by saying,
more times than not.
So your argument doesn't bring us to a point of therefore the show is good. It just brings us to a point of therefore we can guess that the show is probably good, which is a really mundane conclusion compared to what you claimed earlier.
Batman the Animated Series is the greatest animated series committed to television. You could not like the series, but it's still the greatest of all time. You could not like ice cream, but you'd be wrong. You could not like puppies, but you'd be wrong. These are universal truths. It's objectively good. I can't prove that to you. It's just my opinion. But you'd still be wrong if you said it's bad.
This is your brain. This is
life experience.
This is your brain on
life experience.
So, if it's objectively good, that means by definition that it's not just your opinion. It means there's more to the claim than just how you feel, and you should be able to demonstrate why it's the case. If you're gonna immediately backtrack and say, it's just my opinion, I can't prove it, why even say it's objective? Do you just like the sound of the word? Do you think it adds more weight to what you say? Maybe you're just saying this as a joke. I really hope so, but this isn't the first time you contradicted yourself, so I can't say for sure.
But then, like, if you're going to go out there and say that stuff, don't protect your tweets afterwards. Come on. Come on now. Come on now. You're supposed to be, hopefully he'll learn from this. I was a little disappointed to see that.
So that's the last bit of the stream that has to do with Southpaw. I'm not going to defend his decision to protect his tweets, mainly because I just don't care one way or the other. I understand why he would do that. I also understand why others would consider it a bad look. Just whatever. It's not the concern of this video. What I do want to address is that you said you're disappointed in Southpaw and hope he learns. Learns what? I can infer part of what you want him to learn is to not protect his tweets when he gets too big of a backlash. But that can't be all there is, otherwise you would have focused much more heavily on that decision. So what else is there for him to learn? You haven't demonstrated any instance of him saying something that was untrue or of him using flawed reasoning. So the only other lesson I can think of is don't criticize Batas. Or to be more general, don't criticize anything that's really popular. Whenever you're reviewing something, just look around, see what everyone else thinks, and say, I think that too. So here's the thing, I know this is a live stream, you're talking off the cuff, so I shouldn't expect perfectly detailed and thorough defenses. But even with that in mind, I think it's fair to expect that after you've made your argument, we would at least know what your position is. You aren't concluding that Batas is good based on any clear standard, instead you're assuming that it's good and desperately searching for any argument that leads to that conclusion, even if it means immediately discarding the argument for a new one you like better. You say it's the best animated show of all time, but also say we shouldn't expect it to be as good as anything made today. You say it's disingenuous to call something objectively bad because we all have biases, but you have no qualms calling something objectively good despite the fact that you have biases. You say that Batas is good because it's really popular, but then immediately admit that that's not a reliable standard. And you do all of this without even a hint of self-awareness. You started this off bringing up your age and life experience, implying that this is meant to be a teaching moment for people who are young and don't know any better. But there's really nothing to learn. You would have been better off just saying, Southpaw's wrong, Batas is great, with no clarification. At least then we could assume that you have reasons and just aren't divulging them. But now it's clear that you don't have any reasons. Batman the Animated Series is good because it's good. It has to be good. Full stop. So that's all I have to say. Thanks for watching, and more importantly, thanks for waiting. I don't think I'm going back to making videos regularly. This is probably just a one-time thing, but who knows? I know it's weird that my first video in forever would be focused on a TV show that I've never watched, but again, whether the show is great or awful or just decent doesn't really matter. This is just about standards. Whether or not you think Batasse has consistent writing, whether or not you think consistency should even be the standard for quality, I don't care. Just be clear with what your position is. If Batman the Animated Series is good, then it should be easy to defend it without using mental gymnastics. And if it's not good, who cares? You can still enjoy it just as much as you did before. No one's gonna call you wrong based on whether or not you like a TV show.
And it's totally fine to not like Batman the Animated Series. You're wrong. You're absolutely wrong.
Well, almost no.